I'm Alexander Perry Morgan, Jr., born in 1924 in Paris, France, and have lived here since I was 3 in the United States. But essentially, I went to school in New York City, the Buckley School, and then to St. Paul's School as a boarding school in Concord, New Hampshire, and then had my freshman year at Princeton starting in June and ending in January when I was drafted for 3 years in the Army till 42, 43 through 46, I guess.
You were here for your 5th reunion in Princeton.
Well, maybe. Anyway, I graduated finally in 49. Was valedictorian of the class in 49. And graduate architectural firm, living in their house in New York City until I became engaged to Elizabeth. And we moved down here to an apartment in our grandparents' house in Princeton, New Jersey, called Constitution Hill, named after the Stockton family who had previously owned the property and where the state constitution was said to have been signed. And we started living in here. Down here, my parents fixed up an apartment in the main house for their weekends and summer visits. And my sister and brother-in-law and her family took over a main part of the mansion for their own house for a number of years until they built their own house on land that the
vegetable garden,
which now had been the vegetable garden, a big formal rectangular vegetable garden. And I always remember that because it was a crisscross of sort of vineyard construction of posts and beams and things that held up the vines. And the grandchildren's little garden was the first on the right as you came in the vegetable garden. And since then, that has become a separate property. And the perimeter over the years had been sold off, bounded by Stockton Street on the south and Elm Road on the east and Rosedale Road on the northwest. And that's how it was until 1979, going on to 1980, when we had to felt we really ought to develop the land in a different way to make it a better development for Princeton, considering the open space so close to town, trying to keep the feeling of open space and yet in private ownership. So we came up with this system of condominium arrangement which worked out finally after quite a big struggle with the town fathers and everybody, but the zoning board finally agreed with us that this would be the weighted unit, which was to leave single-family independent residences for the 8 properties that would fit on the borough part of the land, which was a small part of the land. And the bigger part of the land in the township could be developed as cluster housing, sort of 2 by 2, spread out around the perimeter of what had been the open field, which also meant that the property already sold off on the perimeter on the east, south, and east, north, I guess it is, east, north, and partially the west would all be saved in open space. And that's where we stood when finally getting the municipal approvals for proceeding with Constitution Hill east and west. And it's divided into the mansion and some units on the east side coming off of Elm Road, and the major part of the new units come in from the northwest side from Rosedale Road, and they divide as just a walking path between the 2 halves, which obviated any through traffic trying to beat the lights at Elm Road and Rosedale Road and Elm Road and Stockton Street.
It was open, but then
it had been open, but only trucks really had used it much, and so it became just a path. And I guess that's how it existed, pretty much as I mentioned, into dividing it between East and West Constitution Hill. And I can't think of much more to say, really.
that's perfect.
And
Liz? Well, I'm Liz Elizabeth Morgan. I met Perry in New York when my roommates, we were the 3 L's, and they were going to go skiing, and they were going to go to Switzerland. And I had lived with my grandmother in Paris for a year, and I'd skied all over Europe, and I told them they had to go to Austria. What's more, they had to go to St. Anton, Austria. And so they met Perry, who was on a Fulbright in Europe, and so they brought him back alive. And I'm a first-generation American, so it's very interesting to me, having had no family here at all, to have this enormously huge family. When we were married, we said we were going to have a little wedding, and Perry's mother gave us a list of 100 of their closest relatives. There were a lot of Morgans and a lot of Coles.
Don't pick at
Anyway.
fingers.
Yeah. So we've lived here now. We say we're the only couple who still live in the same place and are still married after 61 years. I'm not sure if it's true, but I bet it is.
Start with your family.
My father grew up in La Paz, Bolivia, where his father was in the tin mining business, and his, I think, great-grandfather had emigrated from Yorkshire England to Argentina, and then finally settled in. Well, he became Chilean, and my grandmother was from Peru. Her father was the first ambassador from Spain to Peru, and her mother was French from Barcelona. One of them was from She was born in Barcelona, and they had a planned marriage. She was 13 when they met. They were married when she was 16. They went across Lake Titicaca for their honeymoon, and my father was sent
Your
off
father
to
was,
what?
what was his name, Harrison?
My father
Yeah.
was Henry Alexander Harrison, and he was shipped off to school in Germany when he was 8 years old into Dresden. The war broke out with his 3 or 4 brothers, and the First World War broke out, and so they couldn't get back and forth. And so he grew up virtually with no family. Then, when the war ended, he went to work for Schroeder Banking in London and met my mother, who was a dancer with Charlot's Revue, which I have a book of his. He was very famous in that time. She was on Broadway in 1924 and 1926, I think it was. And they met in London, and then came over, got married, came over here, and I was born in Greenwich, Connecticut, and was very fortunate to have been able to go all through school on scholarships. So I'm very grateful to the America, USA.
And your father was with Schroeder's?
Was what?
With Schroeder's?
Yes.
Yeah, good.
And then he came over
Big
here and was on his own. And he did a lot of import-export
Sure.
business to South America.
Mhm.
But he had 2 sisters and how many brothers? A bunch of brothers, and they all got divorced. They grew up without, any family. They didn't know what family life was all about. But anyway, they had interesting
lives.
interesting lives. So I have a lot of relatives all over in Europe, France, and there were 5 major families.
Well, wait a minute. Maybe we'll
It's on. It's on.
Oh, go ahead.
I mean, at this era, and they were all friends. The Russells were friends of the Morgans, and that's why they came here. Next door here, where the Hun School is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And then that Junius and Pine, what's his name?
Russell Pine.
No. I can't remember his names. But Pine, Percy Pine, and the other Pine were great friends because they did a lot of stuff at the university together. And then the next door, the Armours, where the head of
the president's
house
Oh, yeah, sure.
is now. And they were great friends. Pines, Morgans, Russells, can't remember. There are a couple of others.
And this was the 18th and 19th century?
This was when yes, and before this house, because this was not the first house that was built.
Correct.
The Marquands, Pines,
Mm-hmm.
Russells, Morgans, Armours. Is that about 5?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's about it.
And the Morgans, I think, were sort of the last.
Latecomers.
They were the latecomers.
Yeah.
The others were all here before. And there are wonderful pictures of all these different families, and their histories are so fascinating.
Where did the Stocktons fit in?
The Stocktons, it was all Stockton land,
I got it.
and then they sold it off
Off to these
to these families.
Got it. Thank you.
and plus
Right.
other land. I mean, they owned most of New Jersey, I think,
Right, okay.
and some of.
They were the
New
big
York
family,
State.
Yeah.
They were. You should go and.
Yes,
I mean,
will.
the Stocktons were first landowners in this part. I mean, they had
Country.
what do you call it? Leases or land gifts
Yeah.
from England.
Right.
So, way back. So the Morgans were newcomers.
So they weren't very grateful to King George.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
So let's take
So-
it from there and move on into the Morgans and Josephine.
And so the Morgans, Josie and Junius met because they were introduced by her uncle, Henry Fairfield Osborne, who was teaching at the university.
And
later,
what was her name? Yeah.
later became Lucretia was his wife, and he became the head of the Museum of Natural History in New York. And so they built this house with, I guess they thought that an English style house would be nice, and as Perry didn't mention, it's such a wonderful house because there's so much glass. Particularly for that period, the houses that were built were fairly gloomy and dark, and Constitution Hill has so much glass, which was lovely. And they
Well, it was the Jacobean.
Jacobean style house, yes. And they
uh,
certainly had wonderful times here. We have pictures of wonderful family parties and musicals in the front hall and dances and and pictures of wonderful vacations in Nova Scotia and Maine and all around. I think they had a wonderful 10 years together until he left and went to Paris and lived the rest of his life. He came back periodically, apparently, and there's huge correspondence, which is at the university. And at one point, he suggested that they get together again, but she was very busy with her daughter's wedding, and she said, well, we'll talk about it later, and it never happened. But she
Susan
lived.
Osborne, was that her
Mhm.
maiden name?
What?
What was Josephine's maiden name?
Josephine Adams
Adams.
Perry.
Right.
And
Perry.
Okay.
she was descended, her mother was an Adams, so she was descended from John Adams, and also from the her two great uncles were Commodore Oliver Hazard Perry, who opened up Japan, and then Commodore
Matthew
Matthew
Calvert.
Calbreth Perry, who opened up Japan.
There were 5 brothers in the Navy, and the oldest was, well, which was the oldest?
Battle of 1812.
Yeah,
That was Oliver Hazard.
Oliver
Perry,
Hazard
at
was
the Battle of 1812.
Yeah,
And he was killed in that battle.
and there was a brother,
I'm not sure.
Oh, I thought
Matthew Calbreth Perry was the one that opened up Japan, and another brother was Christopher Raymond Perry, who was lost in the Navy at sea in South America.
That was the one that I showed you the picture of the little boy.
Oh, okay, thank you.
And I forget who, well, Matthew Calbreth, Oliver Hazard, and what was my great-grandfather's name?
Alexander James Perry, or James Alexander Perry.
Was it?
Yeah,
Isn't that funny? It doesn't ring a bell anymore.
I think that's right. Anyway,
Anyway,
so she had this very interesting historic genealogy. Her family came
well,
over.
her father was in the army, and he was stationed in the quartermaster corps in various parts of the country as it really was developing. And that included Texas and Oklahoma, I think, and further west. She was a young girl in San Francisco at a period when there was a big ball for young women, sort of a coming out party kind of an arrangement. And so she was well traveled and really always took charge of her own life pretty much. And I remember her as a boy always being a little frightened of her because she was sort of domineering. And I'm sure my grandfather felt the same way, although I never knew him. I'd met him a couple of times when I was younger than a teenager, I guess, in 7, 8, or 9 years old, when he would come to New York for a quick visit. I remember seeing him in our house, our apartment in New York, and that's about all, except that he did give me my first big standard gauge electric train for Christmas.
Oh, did he?
Yeah, the ones that had engines this big, you
Sure.
know. So I don't know. I wish I'd known him more because he sounded like a fascinating person. And
But she apparently talked endlessly about her life and her travels and her being crossing the country and being chased by Indians. And it's just a shame that there was no recording device. And
yeah,
in the house, when we emptied the house, she had so much genealogy. She traced her ancestry back to Charlemagne.
Really?
and to Pippin le Bref. Well, I think old people tend to do this, but she did it in a big way. And she loved all her ancestry and talked about. I just wish I'd known her. She must have been a fascinating woman. And she was so involved in the life of Princeton. And after Junius had left, she helped start the present day club and the auxiliary, the infirmary at Princeton. And
well, she was very anti
billboards.
billboard advertising,
Yes.
so that we would be taken out. My sister and I'd be taken out on Sunday drives in the limousine with the chauffeur, and she would have us stop at each of the billboards as she came across them and to check whether they had their license or not. Oh,
But she certainly must have been a powerhouse and very important in the whole life of Princeton, of getting things started. I mean, not only the present day club, but
but the town.
the garden club.
Mhm.
She was very involved in the garden club as well, and I think was presidents of all these various organizations at various periods. And she must have had a wonderful secretary, because when we were emptying the house, all the minutes of their meetings were all just in perfect order. And those organizations were very appreciative of that. But would you like to hear a little bit about emptying the house? Because that was just daunting.
Sure, go ahead.
Would you?
What, emptying the house?
Well, the house was just stuffed with stuff. They never threw anything away. I found a little ball of string that said, to small to save, but they'd saved it. But there were over 3,000 magazines. There were clothes that we gave to the Metropolitan, materials that went to the Brooklyn Museum. The Dutch Room went to the Historical Society in Newark. They subsequently sold it to a interior decorator. But there was just so much stuff that they saved and bought and collected. And it was a huge undertaking trying to figure out who might want what. And because...
Well, particularly it was really her. She was the one who never threw anything out. She just saved everything, thinking it was important.
Well, and he had bought a lot of stuff. They
weren't around very long together, so.
Well,
this is where you found so much stuff about World War I.
Hmm?
About World War
I. And then there was so much stuff to do with World War I. There, I mean, he was a member. He was in the ambulance corps. Is that what you said? Is the name of it?
Well, I think it was called the
American Field Service.
American Field Service. Yeah. And he was very involved.
But he was very independent at that point,
And also, J.P. Morgan's daughter was very busy in Europe with the soldiers and helping people. But they had recipes for special cakes. I can't remember. It was endless. And little cards and little just all sorts of things to do with World War I. And she was particularly involved in this organization called the Women's Land Army of America during the Great War, where they raised fruit and vegetables. It must have been a fascinating organization. There's a whole book written about it. Anyway, where were we?
The house.
Do you want more of?
The really when I guess Josephine's family arrived here, is that? I mean, do you have any information about that? Like more?
What?
You wanted to talk about Josephine.
Oh well,
things that you felt needed to be
yes,
shared.
Yes. I mean, when Collins did this thing, I think I told you, we told them a lot of stuff and gave them all these pictures so they could do this, but then they said to me, "Oh, she was from the other side of the tracks," and I almost, I just couldn't believe. And so she's never been, I don't think, given her fair share, because she must have been an extraordinary woman. I mean, even though they didn't get along, she was a powerhouse and very influential in Princeton in the growth of all sorts of organizations.
You said her family came over from
the Mayflower.
The Mayflower.
Yes, they did, and settled in Rhode Island. Mm-hmm. There's a big Perry museum there in Newport. I thought no.
Are you
it's not
sure
Newport.
They came over on the Mayflower?
Yes. We have all that stuff about it. And the Morgans came over very early on and settled in Springfield, and there's a lot of about them. I don't think it was quite as early as the Mayflower,
and then
but
moved
shortly afterwards.
Yeah, moved to whatchamacallit.
They lived outside of New York City, and
they moved to
Hartford.
Hartford, yeah.
Yes, where they were very. Hartford they had the Wadsworth Museum in Hartford.
Yeah.
They were very busy with that, and very influential. Well, all through, I think they were farmers to begin with, and then they made quite a lot of money probably in real estate. Anyway, they were very well to do, and his was it her? No, his father was in London.
Whose father?
Junius's father was in London
Yeah.
for years, for 10, 15, 20 years with doing business. Wasn't it his father?
Thought so.
George Hale, who built Bedford Hall. No, it was her.
No,
It was the grandmother's father, who was the father also of J.P. That's what it was, sorry.
The wife was the daughter of J.P.
No, it was the sister.
Sister,
J.P. and
Sarah
Sarah
Spencer.
Spencer were brother and sister. And she married a Morgan married a Morgan.
Yeah,
She married
that
George Hale Morgan.
complicated it
Yeah,
even more.
It's complicated. Yeah. Anyway, so they weren't the nouveau riche group who were rising in America. They already had it all.
The Morgans.
What?
The Morgans.
Both.
Oh.
Yeah, on both sides. His money came from his mother, who was a sister of J.P.
Okay.
And then Junius was the nephew, who was very close. They were very close, closer than his children, I think, even. And Junius was very active, not only with the art museum here and the library here at Princeton, but with the Morgan Library, and helped get introduced JP to his first director, and when he left, sent books and for information about books, was in touch with the Morgan Library, and he really got his uncle collecting books. Prior to that, he'd been collecting art and other stuff, but he really got the Morgan Library going. Oh, you want more history? You want more about her?
Or whatever you wanted
Whatever.
to share.
I've forgotten what I told you. We've done the history, her background. Oh,
We didn't talk about John Adams, did you?
Oh, John Adams, yes. One of her, on her mother's side, she was descended from John Adams. And yes, we had a portrait in the front hall of John Adams. I don't know if it's in this picture, which is now in the National Portrait Gallery.
Hmm.
And anyway, there was a lot to unload of various things, and then we had this huge house auction, which unfortunately there was a strike for the New York Times that wasn't very well advertised, but that's
It was a what?
the strike. Remember the New York Times? Yes, there is this portrait of John Adams in the front.
Where?
Oh no, you can't see it. Anyway,
Where is it?
the portrait of John Adams. But here's the portrait. You can see how much stuff there was everywhere from these pictures. Books. Christie sold off the books in the library.
I think we've covered
Okay.
a lot. I think on the way out, I wouldn't mind taking a couple of
Yeah.
looks at the Lindbergh.
Good.
What
Sorry to be so confused.
No, that's fine. It's
Jump
fine.
around.
What
It's-
I want to do though is I want you to.
Anyway.
So
All right.
we were
Well, I
born.
remember, I don't remember being born, obviously, but I do remember when I was about 3 or 2.5, I guess. There was great excitement, particularly with my father and mother,
What year were you born?
24.
Right, 24, and you were born in
Paris.
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 Okay, and then so you remember about
So
2.5.
about 26 or 7, whenever it was that Lindbergh flew,
I think it was May of 27.
May of
Across the Atlantic.
27.
I think so. We'll look it up.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. We've got
If it
that.
May of 27, then I was 3
Mhm.
exactly. And I remember being taken out to the main boulevard because Lindbergh's procession was going through this great feat of crossing the Atlantic. And I remember not seeing him because I don't know whether he was standing in the front of the car. It was one of those, what I've always called a pneumonia model, where the back of the limousine is all enclosed, but the driver and the assistant driver are out in front in the open with a windshield. And whether they were in the back or the front, I don't know, but I remember being very disappointed that I'd missed seeing them after all the excitement that my parents had gone through to get out to Le Bourget Field and be there when they landed. And so I remember a few years later, back in New York, because when I was 3, I and my sister came back, and the parents followed to New York City, where we had an apartment on 84th Street. And I heard all this shouting and screaming at night. And it actually was the crash, the stock market crash, that everything, the shouting of the latest extras went off into the evenings and dark. And I thought it was because Lindbergh had died, so I was very upset. It was Lindbergh who'd crashed, not the financial stock market. And so from then on, I guess my parents had some wonderful etchings. I forget who they were by now, Lebrun or
Yeah,
something.
well, we've got them. We can show them to you.
But of Lindbergh flying the Atlantic, and one of a picture of him, portrait of him. Well, anyway, I remember there's a high point in my early life was the excitement of what was really going on.
But the parents were somehow friends of the Lindberghs, and we've tried to find out how or why. They visited them in Hawaii.
Who did?
Your parents,
Visited.
the Lindberghs, when they were in Hawaii. Remember they moved there, and
I don't remember.
you don't remember that? I do. Anyway, but Perry's sister, who lives here, she doesn't know why or what. But somehow they became friends. I don't know what the connection was. Anyway.
I think it was.
Well, they lived here in Hopewell, which wasn't far from Princeton either. And,
with the kidnapping. Did they know them then, do you think? I don't know.
I think they must have.
Maybe.
I mean, if they knew them all through that period.
Who knows?
But I wasn't aware they knew them that intimately.
Yeah, that helps a lot. Thank you. It was May of 1927.
Yeah, we have an invitation because Perry's parents were invited to this lunch when Lindbergh arrived in Paris, and we have the invitation.
Well, maybe we'll get a picture of that.
We'll show you. I'll show you we've got the Lindbergh memory first name. Anyway, she lives here. She has a unit here.
Okay.
And it was her husband who was
Tom Jameson.
Collins' lawyer,
That was Tom Jameson.
Tom Jameson, who was her Collins' lawyer, who really was so good.
Yeah.
He, without him, and without Barbara Johnson, who worked at Town Topics, who wrote up
Oh, yeah.
all these meetings, she, very accurately, so that, because it was very confusing, and so that the people in the town understood what was going on. The two of them really made it work, I think.
Okay.
I mean, because they were so, Tom Jameson was just the loveliest man.
The purchase of the land, the farmhouse, the mansion. We need a little more on the driveway, the Stockton farm, what led up to it before the mansion was built, right? The Stockton house and the historical significance of the signing of the New Jersey Constitution. Isn't that right?
Right.
Yes, I think so.
A little of that, and then we need to go to the other end and the actual, a few minutes on the development process of actually getting the approvals to develop the property, which you had covered on your 90th birthday with us, the development
guess.
of the property, and then
I
your
guess so.
your
Yeah.
vision about the homes, the architectural aspect of the homes themselves, which was, we don't look in anybody else's homes.
Yeah.
I mean, it was quite fascinating. I mean, it's great. I
Yeah.
thought. And I think the homeowners would be interested in that.
Okay.
And then,
Well, this is the planning of the arrangement of the new units.
yeah,
Yeah.
That you talked about at your,
at the yeah. So the approval process that you went through, I think you retained some attorneys and got approval from the
Horrendous.
township and the borough
Yes.
to develop the property.
Well, Liz will have to help me on some names, I'm sure. But
Okay, and then
Okay.
then we'll move to Josephine,
okay,
yeah,
and because that's important.
Tom Jameson.
Tom Jameson was the attorney.
Okay, should we?
Okay. Yeah, we're on.
I think
Yep.
Who
We're on.
was the, I don't know how you say what you,
Well, yeah, when we started out, it was a question of how to go about this, and Princeton had no regulations as such for land development in terms of multiple housing, and that I was aware of anyway. And so when we started out, we thought,
would it be useful to understand why you decided to develop it?
well, we developed it because it was actually, well, it had been, as I mentioned before, 93 acres.
That's cool.
Surrounded by these three main street and then one property line between the Russell estate and the rest of this whole section of Princeton, so to speak. And that, by the time we were contemplating what to do with the rest of with the estate that remained, my mother and I particularly were interested to see it going, but the question was how to do it that would preserve as much as possible of what we'd always enjoyed. And that was, it was down to about 43 acres, because the perimeter, except for a couple of spaces, had been sold off, sort of according to the regulations, one property deep, all the way around the perimeter, leaving us with about 47 acres, I guess it was. And that maintained one unit's width over on Stockton Street, which was the main entrance to the house that circled in front of the main house. counterclockwise, uh, ending up in this rectangle here, this square, which was all gravel and was just the place where all the horses and carts and different things would come and park underneath that roof over there, which was open shed, which is now enclosed, and a hedge built up over it. But that really, after horses had given out and cars came in, then this became an apartment where a caretaker lived with his family. And there was another apartment, sort of a one-bedroom apartment above the western end of the building, which was one that ultimately my grandmother used as a place to go in the winter instead of trying to heat the whole main house.
Sure.
And so, as a boy, I visited there with my sisters, and in the summers, early spring, we would go over to the main house, and we each had our own bedroom and had a wonderful open house, so to speak, when spring came. And it was always great fun because the dining room was open to whatever family members were anywhere nearby. And they all came for some of the big meals of the day, like Easter and later in the summer. And we all sat around the big table in what was the dining room, which then became an apartment. And that was the living room of the new apartment once it was all divided up into 60-some units. The main house was divided into basically 6 units, and then 2 units, 7 and 8, were the part of the carriage house here, and this room, which you're sitting in, which is sort of about half of the carriage house, going all the way to the far end where there was a narrow stair going upstairs. But basically this was one apartment, and that was 2 apartments once the automobile took over and horses weren't inhabitant. So I don't remember too much about when automobiles took over, but I gather it was about 1908 or early 1900s, and that's when the horses disappeared, and there was always a driveway coming in, which was just sort of one 50-foot right-of-way coming in from Elm Road to get into the service and kitchen end of the main house, and then into here, as I mentioned, and then out to the front door and around down to Stockton Street. And when it came time to develop this, which my mother and I particularly felt it was absolutely necessary to do something about it because of the enormous taxes, as well as the fact it was so close into Princeton, that I said, well, what I'd like to do is develop it into a condominium in which we can at least plan out how to arrange the new buildings in such a way that everyone got as much privacy as possible and take advantage of the 47 acres. There had been a project across Stockton Street, part of the
Marquand,
Marquand Park,
their house.
or the Marquand Estate, I guess it was, or the Pine,
Marquand House.
or Marquand House became a development of a series of apartments in the main house and had land to go with it. So we were following in a sense in what had happened there, thinking it might make it easier to get approval for something that was larger in scale here and based on more independent living units clustered in such a way that it gave both privacy but open space to the land. And so that's what happened. It was a big struggle with the planning board and the zoning board and everybody, and thank goodness for Tom Jameson and several others who helped with the process of getting it through the whole business. It was complicated because, what's his name, who developed it?
Collins.
Arthur Collins, who had been in architectural school before going into real estate development because his father was a big real estate developer in New York, New York City, I guess. And he finally agreed to take on Constitution Hill as which became his first project in Princeton. He and his partner, Emil Spina, were the ones who really took over making the transfer to a condominium estate system.
Thought it was Arthur Emil.
What?
Arthur Emil, I thought was his name.
Arthur Collins.
Arthur Emil. I'm sorry. Never mind.
No, Emil Spina.
Can you said Spina. All right. Can you
Well,
block
anyway.
it out?
Yeah.
Anyway, that's
Anyway.
what happened. And after a lot of back and forth with the planning board and everything, we finally were able to go before the zoning board, and they approved what we wanted to do. And from then on, it took off. And the first really was the redevelopment of the house, the main mansion, and the apartments here, and some units over on the east side here, which was in the borough. And since part of the land was in the borough and didn't provide for larger units like we wanted to do, they were pretty definite that the amount of land we had, which was enough for, I think, 6 or 8 lots, would have to be single-family houses, just an individual house and land. And everything in the township then could be divided into twin houses, which meant 2 of them backed up like that in sort of L-shaped. And the idea was, because this I'd seen in a program of sort of a wonderful development in Norway or Sweden, where the houses were arranged in such a way that everyone had the privacy of open space within the V, and the rest of the land essentially was all part of the development of the whole property. And so that's what we did for 2x2 for the rest of the land. And that ended up with, was it 6 units in the main house and 2 units here, 8. And then out of that, there was the remainder of the 60 units, so 52, I guess, that were planned in clusters around the sort of the wooded area here, which was always more wooded, and then going out into the open field on the western side, where actually they found that they could, well, when over here, when they tried to develop the houses here with basements, they found there was so much rock fairly low down that they gave up on it, so that these are all single family houses but with no basement, and but garages and so on. And the houses, as they got over on the west side, could have the basement, and they took a lot of the land that they excavated from this end for whatever excavation they did. They put in that area over there so that the ground no longer fell into a much bigger dip going down towards Rosedale Road than it had originally. But that meant that they could put basements in as the ground dropped off.
Sure.
And the more fertile ground over there was rearranged and brought up higher to the first floor, and the basements were put in. And so that made the whole thing work out much more on a level arrangement, although slightly dipping. And well, as I say, that was finally got through. Thank goodness for the planning board, I guess it was, that said sounded like a good idea to them. And then we were off. Is that a bing?
No, I just want to make sure it's.
How many years did it take you to get it through the planning and zoning board, and what year did you start the whole process?
Oh gosh.
About.
Well, 1980 was sort of the critical year when we got the permission.
Okay.
And 1979, end of 78 or 79 was when we began more or less sounding out what we could do.
Thank you.
It was about a year, wasn't it? Or a little over a year.
Sounds like it.
I would say about a year and a half at least, yeah.
Okay, thank you.
And once it got settled, it proceeded working from this, where are we, the eastern end over here, following around to the western end and up, down and up what grade there was left, with 2 units being the furthest west, up on the hill looking down over the lower units. And that fortunately was one lot off of Rosedale Road that had not been sold off, so that was a full lot's width, plus had room for the main western entrance to the whole project, whereas the Stockton Street entrance, which was very close to the stoplight on Elm and Stockton, was such a busy intersection that it made it difficult to make that sort of the main entrance to get to Constitution Hill. So as a result, the rear entrance, which came off of Elm Road and into the service area of the main house mansion, became essentially the main route into the project from that direction, which then could circle not only into the service units here and bypass this courtyard you see here, which became part of the units in the stable carriage house. And just outside the wall there is a driveway that enters the garage, new garages for the 6 units in the main house. And on beyond that was an extension of the back driveway coming in to go to the front of the house and the circle in front of the house, so that the whole land went off as sort of a lawn towards Stockton Street without any driveway in it. And in fact, what they did was they had to put detention basins for the stormwater, or where the ponds are now, both sides of the driveway as it enters from Rosedale Road. You go down and across sort of a covered sluiceway that joins those two. And they dug a big pit out here towards Stockton Street that went way down as a detention basin. And they found that what they hit was a special sort of a sand pocket in the whole area on that side, which drained all the water off automatically. So that has always been just a dry gully. It never maintained any water, although it was built as a detention basin.
We could fill it in.
Yeah, well,
That's interesting.
That's where all the deer hang out.
Sure.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I mean, there's so much
Could be
clay
filled
and
in.
rock. That's it's unusual to have a sand pocket, right? I mean,
but it was blocked officially by, since they preserved one lot's width over there, that lot had a single entrance. One lot out of the 60 was one that all by itself came off of Stockton Street into that far unit, and had no direct access into the circulation within the rest. But that was the exception to the rule, so to speak. And well, as far as development goes, I can't think of anything else except that the way it was arranged was to cluster these double houses, mostly in semicircle rings, so that you came in and drove to your garage unit, and your front door was just beyond the garage units, so that everybody's unit could basically be looking out into the open woods or the open fields or whatever. by going around in the circle and not looking directly as, well, there are a few, maybe a couple that are more directly observant of each other, but most of them have separate views and a feeling of privacy, even though they were doubled up.
It's pretty nice.
I know, it's wonderful.
And even the single families are that way. We can see the fields and we don't look into other people's privacy.
Yeah, the single families were just more or less bordered on this eastern side,
That's what we're.
and they were looped around also, and so they overlooked open space.
Do you want to spend just a few minutes talking about the Stockton house that existed before the mansion was built and its reference to the history and the driveways and the way that people would come into that, the farmhouse that you mentioned last time? We had not recorded it.
Well, I'm not sure that I'm not that knowledgeable about really how that all worked. I don't know. I always assumed that the entrance came off of Stockton Street over on the south side here, but I'm not positive.
But the Stocktons owned the property before your grandfather
Yes,
bought it.
yeah,
Okay.
yeah. But I wasn't around to see any of
No,
that.
That's fine.
I can't say how that all worked or what the extent of it was. I just know that it was more or less bounded by Stockton Street, Elm Road, and Rosedale Road
Right.
as a pure rectangle.
Okay.
And then my grandparents built a house for their daughter, Aunt Sarah Gardner, which is the one just opposite
Hodge Road.
Hodge Road, where Hodge
Sure.
Road comes into Elm.
Right.
If you go right across, there's sort of a formal house and a wall and
Right.
prune trees and
Well, we can look up Stockton's a little bit. That's all we need, I think, for that.
Yeah.
I don't know if
the
it's,
Stocktons would be interesting to look up to see exactly, well, not only who they were, but
Yeah.
one of them was the signer of the independence.
Right. No, that's why I think it would be
And
interesting just to take a
another
look.
one was something to do with New Jersey and
The New Jersey Constitution.
Constitution.
We can look that up. a
But
little
there are
bit.
different people you could look up easily, I'm sure.
Okay,
Yeah.
and then we can share it with you.
Mhm.
I don't know if it's of interest, but because of Perry's cluster plan, the neighbors didn't understand this and fought fiercely. We thought we were being so smart, we invited them in sort of small groups for sherry, and then they all ganged up against us.
Well, some of them did.
Yeah,
anyway.
and
not,
hired a
not
lawyer.
all of them did. So
It was a big struggle.
What was their objection? Just the increase?
They just didn't understand this cluster housing.
Oh, I see.
They were used to seeing
I got
houses
it.
on.
Thank you. That
Yes.
makes sense.
yeah,
I thought-
separate
I
lots and
thought
separate
Perry
houses.
was going to have apoplexy.
Change is hard for human beings.
I was gonna say, people, right, people don't like change.
Yeah, I mean, it was just a whole new thing they didn't understand.
Thank you. That was a good addition.
No good.
Thank
Oh, yeah.
you.
Oh, yeah.
Well, should we go on to
Yeah, can we
Joseph?
get it? Yeah, let me stop this and create a new file.
Yeah.
So the other thing that I would do for the actual recording is get a better microphone
Mhm.
so that it's, this one will pick up good enough, but I think a better one, and that's one of the things that I wanted to invest in just in
Yeah.
general. But yeah, so this is recording right now.
Oh,
It is.
Mm-hmm.
All right.
oh,
Well, then we can start at the beginning as
Mhm.
far as I can remember it. or have been told about it. My grandparents bought this 93 acres, bounded by the main streets. And then over the years, well, my grandfather left my grandmother and lived in Paris and did his work there. And he was sort of a classic scholar, and a collection of books, so remind me of the names.
Well, it's right here.
The,
Virgil.
Okay.
Virgil.
yeah. He had probably the
Okay.
greatest collection of Virgil in the country, and gave it to the university.
He started collecting when he was
And,
out there.
but he really liked the life in Paris and in Europe as much as he liked it here.
That's not why he left.
What?
That's not why he left.
No, that's not why he left. But anyway, he left to live there, and my grandmother had two children, my father and an older daughter who was my Aunt Sarah Gardner. And they were given a lot, which is at on Elm Road here.
The end of
Where?
Hodge Road.
Okay.
The end of what?
Hodge Road.
Hodge Road. If you went
This house that's been
at the end of Hodge Road, if you went straight ahead, you'd run right into the house.
It was a wedding present.
And that started once he'd gone, and my grandmother was really alone and living in the fairly big house, the mansion. She just, over the years, decided that they really would have to sell off the perimeter of the property, which bounded the streets, except for one lot here on Stockton Street and a narrow entrance off of Elm Road, which comes.
And Rosedale.
And that Elm Road entrance was the service entrance for the whole estate anyway. So that remained. And going around, fortunately, they preserved one lot on the northwestern boundary on
Rosedale.
Rosedale Road, which was in other words, it was the 93 acres was bounded by those three roads, Stockton, Elm, and Rosedale, and then a straight line across what was the edge of the property, the Russell property, all to the northwest and west. And so my father was born in the house and grew up as a boy here at Constitution Hill, which, by the way, got its name from the house, the Stockton House, where it is believed the state constitution of New Jersey was signed or organized. And that's how it got the name Constitution Hill, because it's one of the high points. It's about the highest point in Princeton. And the other highest point is where the University Chapel is. Those 2 points are sort of the highest terrain points, although by then the town had developed more and more and was beginning to expand into the township. The borough was a rectangle in the center of the property, and the line runs several hundred feet off of Elm Road on this east side. And that is the area that was in the borough, and the rest was in the township. And I can't remember the exact number of acres, but it was a line, a borough township line that ran about 300 feet on that whole side. And that made a difference later in planning, because the regulations for the borough and the township were somewhat different. And but anyway, to get back to more of the historical part, my father went to Princeton, the class of 1922. He then immediately was married to my mother after graduation and went off to Paris in order to, he decided that he really wanted to be an architect, and at that time the Beaux-Arts, the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris was really the primary, most famous school of architecture. And also my grandfather was living there. I'm sure that made a difference. And as a result, I was born in 1924 in Paris. And my sister Margaret, who's 2.5 years younger, also was born in Paris while he was doing his studies and all the work involved in getting the architectural education that he got. And he when he came back to brought us all back to this country. We lived in New York City, where he had found a job with Shreve, Lamb and Harmon, who were designing the Empire State Building at the time. And my father, we have a sketch of it. He made the early design sketches for the top of the tower of the Empire State Building.
See, these are things that I want to include that we would scan in and show while you're talking.
Yeah.
You know?
We've got,
So we could take some images,
pictures.
I could take a picture and
Yeah.
or scan it and and as you're talking about it, we can show this as
Yeah,
you're
that
talking.
was in the early days when they felt that the way for people to really get quickly into New York was to come by dirigible
Oh, yeah.
or balloon.
Yeah.
Got
And
our
they
Wow. Oh my
to the
goodness.
top of the Empire
Really?
State.
didn't they actually do that?
But it didn't work.
No, it didn't. No, but they actually attempted to, didn't they? it's like docking to space station.
That's what they
actually
talked
attempted
about.
to. I thought they actually
As
attempted
far
to
as,
do
I
that.
don't know
No?
if they attempted not. I'm sure someone knows, but
Maybe I just saw drawings of what they thought they were
Thought
going
they
to
could
do.
do.
Oh,
Yeah.
that's
Yeah, no, they
interesting.
had planned on docking them up there.
Yeah.
Wow.
yeah, then that would bring them right to the center of New York
Wow.
City.
Isn't that interesting?
That is fascinating.
And maybe you can find a picture of that
Well,
that shows
you know,
the
I mean,
original intent. I think
that's-
they've got them. I think I've seen
that
them.
would be fun.
Well, I don't know. We've got this
Not an actual,
here.
not an actual